So first of all, I have to thank a team that's helped me on, or worked with us on this project. So Jana Greenslit is an evaluator on my team who did incredible work in data collection you're about to see. Natalie Harris, Gloria Segovia, Lauren Applebaum, Cara Grevin, Gary Vi Champagne, which some of you may know because she was employed here a couple years ago. And Ali Murskowski all helped. And then also we have a thought partner and a professor in psychology at DePaul named Kimberly Quinn. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the awe as we're going to use it in this discussion. So my background is astronomy, so you're going to see a lot of astronomy pictures in this talk. And also that means my go-to for quotes is Carl Sagan. So I'll just read this. The dazzling idea of a universe vast beyond imagining swept over me. It has stayed with me ever since, and I sensed awe. That was a quote he gave to describe the first time he saw a dark, starry night as a child, and as how he felt at the time. In one of our early studies around awe at the museum, we interviewed guests and asked them to describe to us a time that they felt awe in their life, and then a time they felt awe at the museum. And we got a lot of responses in these basic categories. First was nature. People talk a lot about, especially large things in nature. Mountains are very popular topics when you ask people about awe, but so is oceans and other very large aspects. We also heard a lot about architecture. Sure, and I think some of that is because our museum, if you haven't been there, we have a beautiful Beaux Arts style building. People talk about it a lot, but also Chicago has a great, glorious skyline. So people like to talk about that as well when we ask them. But usually it was about big, large, grand things. Religion is very popular. Religious experiences in particular are subjects that get brought up quite a lot. In some of the interviews, tears would happen, and a lot of times it had to do with religious experiences. And also one other thing I'll mention in a minute. Art got brought up a lot, but also art in, I should update this slide and say art in music, but art writ large, not just visual art, was talked a lot about. And then finally, the thing that really surprised me the most is people. Well, in the psychology literature around awe, they almost never talk about the people aspect, the social or personal aspects of awe. They talk about it related to things and spaces. But we have a lot of people talk about awe had to do with when I was proposed to, or I did a proposal, when I gave birth, when someone passed away in my family, but also when I saw something through the eyes of someone else, or when the first time I was, or not first time, but one story about when I was surprised that a long lost cousin showed up at my birthday party, and I was just in tears. I was so happy to see them. This aspect is very, very important too. And this is where we would also get tears when we were interviewing people. And a couple of times my staff also got into tears talking to people about these kinds of experiences, the personal aspect of awe. So I'm going to play you in this next slide, it's about a minute, I think, quote from a grandmother talking about her grandson after they had come to the museum and they had gone to an exhibit. I have a picture of it here. That can be a little scary for a young child, and what happened after that. And you can read the dialogue there if you can't hear it.
Plus we were here just a couple days ago, and he was afraid to go in there. And so on the way home, he heard the song that said, I am with you, you don't have to be afraid. And so when we got home, he said, Mommy, he said, Grandma, he goes, I want to go back. And I go, okay. And he goes, I want to go back with the tornado and the lightning, so I'm not going to be afraid. And I said, why aren't you going to be afraid? He goes, because on the way home, Grandpa was playing that song that said that I have no reason to be afraid, that Jesus will be with me, and I don't have to be afraid. So, Grandma, I want to go back. And that really is why we came back today, because we were supposed to go to Navy Pier. We ended up not going to Navy Pier and coming here instead, because he wanted to go back there, which we did. When we got in there was a young man in the middle of the tornado, and and I said to him, look, 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 he's even got a balloon in there now. We went in, and he took like probably about 10 or 11 different children, and he took my grandson as one. And my grandson was like, ah! And he got in there, and he was just clapping and having, you know, and he turns around, he looks at me, and he goes, contained? And I said, yes, contained. And he goes, okay, smile on his face, and he did great, just wonderful. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is wonderful. That's amazing. It is amazing. So, so it's a great time. It is.
Sorry, I thought I was going to stop there, and I think I did not put in the stopper on that one. And but the reason that I love that quote, first of all, is it gets me kind of emotional. I don't know why we get my hand. I also have a trimmer in addition to being a stutterer, so it's kind of hard for me to hit the button here to start the display. There we go. Hopefully it'll come back. Is that it ties into a lot of those aspects of awe that I was talking about earlier. You heard a reference to religion in there. We're talking about a very large physical space there, but most importantly, we're talking about this woman is feeling awe through the eyes of somebody else. It's not something that's happening to her, although it is, but she's talking about it as something happening through somebody else. So this little social aspect of awe, I think, is greatly neglected in the literature right now. So in addition to the awe, there's some negative aspects of awe that people can talk about as well. Sometimes this is referred to in the literature as dark awe, which is a phrase I think sounds like a really good band name for an emo band. But it can be think of the sublime, or that kind of feeling, that tinge of fear that you can sometimes get around a positive, joyous time or environment. So some of the emotions that have been linked to awe are wonder, curiosity, amazement, fascination, and astonishment, which in the psychology literature is often these are often referred to as epistemic emotions that have to do with the learning process or processing something, some bit of knowledge in your mind. But there's also, if you think about that dark awe, emotions such as confusion or disorientation, bewilderment. This was when we started the study, we talked to kids, and we included kids in our pilot test of the study. When we got to this word, they were like, we don't know, what does bewilderment mean? And we were like, well, it's what you're feeling right now. I wish we could have said that all the time. So we realized we need an age-appropriate instrument, and so we had to remove kids from the study. But also fear. So as a completely side note, I love this picture because I'm going to walk over here. But if you look in the middle, it's kind of hard to see here. This man's holding a selfie stick. So even though he's running for his life, he's not going to be restricted from taking his selfies at the time. By the way, this was a rogue wave and not a tsunami. Everybody was okay in this picture. Wow. So what role does awe play in the museum experience? Well, I like to say museums are in the business of awe. When I first heard that awe was a thing that people study, I was like, well, I mean, immediately there was a link to my job and what I was reading here. I was like, this is clearly what we do. We've got to study this and do a little bit more about it. And museums use it in many different ways. One is scale. We have giant spaces, we have giant pieces of art, and usually large, grand scale of things. We like to take away boundaries. This is an image from the mirror maze at my museum, if I can make a plug. Numbers in nature. This exhibit is about patterns and about the Fibonacci sequence, fractals, and things like that on it. And when you're in there, it's really kind of mind-blowing. The compression expansion effect is probably what you're most familiar with, because I don't know of any art institution that is large that doesn't use this in some way. And that's this being put into a small space and then having it open up suddenly into a large space. So it's like, wow, that contrast That's really kind of evokes emotions in people. Well, the museum I'm at, if you've been there, you know we have a World War II submarine exhibit, which is really beautiful and really nice. But to get down to it, you have to walk down this very large hallway that tells the story of World War II leading up to the capture of the sub. The hallway gets darker as you go down the hallway. The hallway gets smaller as you go down the hallway. The hallway even goes down underground, as if you're on a submarine going under the waves on this. And then at the very end of the hallway, it's loud. You got explosions going on around you because there's a simulation happening. And they've got these things on the floor that shake the floor. It's very dark and very small. And then you turn the corner, and you're in this gigantic room, and there's a submarine literally at eye level pointing you in the face, because you're up on a platform. And people freak out at that point. It's a great reveal is the term that we use in the museum world for that. When I'm feeling bad or down or just kind of blah at the museum, I like to go around that corner and sit on the side and just listen to people as they walk and they turn that corner, because you'll hear gasps, you'll hear lots of four-letter words, including kids on it. Ravia's probably heard it. Faith's probably heard it a little bit, who just joined us. As anyone who's been to the museum have heard this, and it kind of gets you excited and reminds you of why you're there. So how does that experience of awe impact a museum visit? Well, we're hoping you're having an awe-inspiring encounter that leads to some kind of emotional affective response, and then some kind of adjustment of mental structures to what you just saw. So the Piagetian notion of accommodation and going on there. And then maybe that leads to some kind of behavioral cognitive outcomes. And that last piece is what we were trying to study at the museum the last few years. So why do we think that it might lead to some kind of cognitive outcome? Well, there's been some prior work in awe. Awe has been studied a little bit in psychology up until around 2004, 2005, and it kind of exploded and became very, very popular. And so there's been a lot of work, especially within the last 4 to 5 years on this topic. Some of my favorite paper is this one, where they took a bunch of undergraduate students and they had them read an essay on grade inflation. The essay had a bunch of really strong arguments on why grade inflation is a thing that needs to be dealt with, and a bunch of really weak arguments and kind of stupid arguments about it also. And then afterwards, they asked the undergraduates to define what were the strong and what were the weak arguments in this essay. Prior to that, they had taken them and they had placed them into 2 groups. One group was told, I believe, to meditate on an awe experience they had in their life for a few minutes. I don't remember exactly how long. The other group was told to meditate on the last time they did laundry, which I thought was an interesting control condition. And they found that those who meditated on the awe experience did much better at pulling out I take that back. They did a little bit better in pulling out the strong pieces of evidence. They did a lot better at rejecting the weak pieces of evidence in that piece. And that kind of led us to starting the study. Some other things that they saw is there's been studies showing that after feeling a sense of awe, people are more pro-social in their decision making. They also are more generous. They also are more likely to think and talk about other people and other things than to be more focused on themselves. And then one paper that talks about that after feeling awe, people had a little bit more of an open mind than before. Almost all of these are lab studies, I should say. I'll come back to that later. So we did a study on awe of phase 1 a few years ago, which Rabia helped us on. And one of the big results of that study was that we found an increase in skepticism. We had an actual skepticism scale, which we found from the accounting literature, because apparently being a skeptic is important if you want to be an accountant. And we found that after feeling awe at our museum, people's ratings on those skepticism scales went up quite a bit compared to the people who were in our control condition, which for our museum was the parking garage. So I want to talk about that study just in one slide so I can set up the current study that we're going to focus on. One is for that study, we did about 1,000 surveys of adults only, as I mentioned earlier, and we did it at different spaces around the museum that we thought would have different levels and types of awe. We also did experience sampling where we texted people on their cell phones as they were going around the museum, and then we had some mobile eye tracking data as well. We asked guests to look at, after they were in the situation that we wanted to measure, so after they saw the submarine, or after they had walked out of the parking garage, we asked them to look at this science-themed imagery that we have put together and describe it using a strategy called visual thinking strategies, which is a very popular educational and assessment curriculum in the art education world. And basically you take someone up to a piece of art and you say, what do you see here? Or why do you say that, and what else do you see here? And you engage the person in a conversation using those semi-structured prompts. And then you code the dialogue based upon these long different sets of codes that we had. So, but basically what we found was that yes, all was different in different places in the museum. It's not a big surprise. After they saw the submarine, they felt a lot of awe. Coming out of the parking garage, they did not feel so much awe. And in some other places, awe went up and down. The experience sampling also showed that awe was highest in our immersive spaces, like the mirror maze. Some of the places that we thought would be really high on awe were just medium levels of awe. Some places that we thought would be medium, like the mirror maze, actually had higher levels, but that immersiveness seemed to be very important. We did not find an impact on awe in their ability to engage in discussion around that science-themed imagery. So our hypotheses were all wrong about that, except for we found that threat variant of awe that I talked about earlier, that negative awe. People who felt higher levels of the negative awe did talk less or participated less in those dialogues and showed less evidence of being able to talk about what they saw in the imagery. So we think it had a negative impact. But we did find the link with skepticism and positive feelings of awe, which we think are aligned with that earlier study I talked about, which is why we included that particular scale. But we also asked people about prior knowledge. How much did you know about the submarine before you came here? How much did you know about military history before you came here when they went to this sub-exhibit? And then we asked some context-specific questions depending upon where they were in the museum. And we found that those who rated themselves as having higher levels of knowledge showed higher levels of awe, which was really surprising to us and goes a little contrary to the psychology literature, which almost exclusively says that awe has something to do with being surprised based on it. So, which I think awe can, but I think that's a very limited view of awe, that it's much more, especially that social aspect of it. So we think that awe is being shown here because people are appreciating what they see more. They've learned so much and they've read about the submarine, now they're actually seeing it, and they're seeing it before their own eyes. And then also through our interviews, as I mentioned earlier, and through that quote that I played, that's much more than space. It's also about the experience, the memories, and the people. So let's talk about eye tracking for a little bit. So we did mobile eye tracking glasses.
Before you get there, you might be talking about it later.
Sure.
But can you say a little bit more about how you measured the positive and negative aspects of awe?
Yes.
Was it using those effective emotional descriptors that you had earlier, or was it
Yeah,
some other
we
way?
had two measures. One was using those descriptors earlier. We just had all these keywords, and it was a Likert scale that they
Okay.
reported on. The other one is we actually have a scale called a situational awe scale, which measures 4 factors of awe. I am going to go into that in a lot of detail in a few slides because we use that same measure for this study here. So you'll get all the details there. So for the eye tracking, they wore these high definition mobile glasses you put on here, and they hook up to something on your belt, and then someone on my team follows you with an iPad and transmits it wirelessly to the iPad as well. And it keeps track of going through the museum. What we found going into our main rotunda, which is this space, is that guests spent 44% of their time looking straight, so they don't fall, hopefully, 33% of the time looking at posters, and 23% of the time just looking up in general. but we found that that upward gaze was associated with higher feelings of liberating and connecting awe. So I mentioned there's 4 factors. That's one of those factors. So looking up, people rated themselves as feeling more awe in terms of feeling liberated and connecting with the world. Around the submarine, this is a heat map, so it's the same data showed in a different way. We found that guests spent 64% of time actually reading signs and panels. That was a big surprise because one of the former directors of exhibits at the museum had come up to me and said, guests would never read anything. And he was sure about that. He had been there 20 years. And so we were able to come to him and say, well, the data says otherwise. Lies on it, and everybody was actually happy to hear that because they did design it. There's one exhibit, they took it so seriously. There's one exhibit that opened about 5 years ago that they had no signs or words or language at all in this exhibit. They wanted a pure constructivist environment. People, I'm thinking Future Energy Chicago. People walk into this exhibit and they're going to figure out what to do, and that's part of the experience. It failed. Within 6 months, we had signs all over the place because kids got in there, got frustrated, and one of the reasons is they were confusing physical limitations of the equipment with what they thought was a goal of the experience. Like some of the bicycles in that particular exhibit, some of the small kids couldn't ride them. The bicycles were just too big, and they thought that was part of the experience. And no, it was actually a design flaw that needed to get fixed on it. So finally, that had to get fixed. So we were happy to see this on it. But we also found that the longer people looked at the submarine, the higher levels of that negative awe I talked about, the oppression, isolated awe that they reported, which is something that, from our perspective, actually this is probably the only time that it's something that we wanted. Because that's kind of one of the big stories of this submarine exhibit, if you go there, is what life was like on board these terrible conditions submarines. They hot bunked. You didn't have your own bed. When you got out, someone else got in. You got one shower every 2 to 3 months. And I'm serious about that, 2 or 3 months. It was on average 90 to 94 degrees on board these vessels the entire time that they're running. Even when they're on the surface, you're not allowed on deck very much at all. I just don't know how people live this way. And so when people are looking at stuff, they're making that kind of connection on it. And then our final eye tracking data from that one is the actual building. So the thing that really started the study, and this is part of what working at a museum and informal learning environment is like, is that everything has to be kind of practical based. Is when I read that one article that talked about awe and its impact on critical thinking, we had just started a capital campaign. We wanted to raise about $370 million for the museum over 5 years. About $75 million of that dollars needs to go into our building, which is about 120, 140 years old, something like that, and falling apart. Funders they want to pay for education, they want to pay for exhibits, they want to pay for toilets, they don't want to pay for plumbing, they don't want to pay to fix a hole in the roof. And so I was thinking, wow, if I could have data that showed that our building was actually part of the user experience museum, then we can use that to try to help raise funds and to fix our building. I'm happy to say we've raised all of the funds to fix the building. It has nothing to do with the big announcement yesterday, if you've heard that. We had done it before that. So it's under construction now and it's getting fixed. But I'm giving you an idea about how everything has to be kind of tied into something practical. So what we did was we put eye tracking glasses on people when they got off the number 6 bus stop across the street and approached the museum. And these are just a sample of 6 of the of individual people, of what they looked at and how their eyes moved. And generally in the analysis of that, we found that the more they looked at the building, as opposed to this park and this lake and all this other stuff that's around it, it was associated with increasing levels of awe related to liberation, which is generally assumed to be a positive awe, and lower levels of awe related to that negative dark awe I talked about. And also smaller levels of awe related to I feel small in the world. And that was a surprise, because this area in front of the museum here is gigantic. It's a really big lawn, and there's a big lake on one side and a couple of buildings back on the other, but it just looks vast and big, and our building looks vast and big. This is the largest science center in the Western Hemisphere here on it. So when you approach it, I think you feel really small on it. And I thought that was actually an issue we had to deal with. but our data doesn't show it. Also, we didn't see any relationship with physiological. Also, like I feel chills or I feel my heart skips a beat. I'm really excited about this. We thought that we would simply because they're outside and the wind's blowing on them and stuff, but people were not reporting that. So all of that data we put together into our first paper. And I'm going to talk about that for a second because I know we have a lot of graduate students here, and I want to talk about the nicest rejection letter ever. We put this together and we submitted it to the Journal of the Learning Sciences for a couple of reasons. One is it's a dream of mine to publish in a journal. I haven't done it yet. Another reason was this is an interdisciplinary topic, multidisciplinary topic that I thought would kind of fit JLS, and I had talked to one of the current editors, and they were like, yeah, this is weird, I'm not sure, but we think you should submit because if it doesn't work out, you at least are going to get really good edits, and it's going to help you prepare your manuscript for your next submission, which I thought was really good advice. So we took it, we submitted it, we got rejected. And here are a couple of quotes from reviewer 2. In short, this is a good educational psychology mixed methods paper about the self-report of all-around museum experiences. I found no faults with the paper, not even one glaring typo. That's up in my office by... but I am not sure of its connection to learning, though some theoretical argument was convincing that there may be one in the future. I don't disagree with that at all. Our learning measure was the coding of the interviews done through visual thinking strategies, which I still believe is a sign of learning, but it's a complicated, complex sign of learning, and not something you typically see in science education or in the Journal of Learning Sciences. You see it in the art education publications and fields. Reviewer 3 said, research methods do not match the way learning sciences typically consider empirical questions about learning. This is an issue with the incompatibility of the methods of the audience rather than the paper itself. So again, I thought that was a very kind and positive way of saying, look, this doesn't fit our audience, but we don't see any real issues with what you're doing here as well. And again, we can't complain about it because I think it is a different and a weird way of putting it. So we didn't object to the editor at all. What we did was we reformulated the paper for an educational psychology journal. I don't remember which one. And it got rejected immediately too at the desk level on that one. And that's because the paper was a mess at that point, because it's not designed in an educational psych way. We didn't do study 1, study 2, study 3. We didn't isolate the variable, didn't do all this stuff, and we tried to put it in that way, and it was just a mess. So we ended up just throwing it up on an OSF preprint server and moving on to this next phase, which I'm going to talk to you about. But I wanted to share that too in all transparency, so you can kind of learn a little bit about how that process worked too for the graduate students who haven't gone through it before. All right, so study 2. So now we want to focus a little bit on emotions and museum learning. And why emotions? There's been a little bit of work, but none of these are really definitive studies. They've been little pot shots here and there looking at emotions and long-term learning that comes out of museum environments. There's been a couple of papers on science museums, including one that I did at the Adler a few years ago. There's been some stuff in environmental conservation, some stuff in history. That's not Price Me there, that's a different Price. And then some stuff in aesthetic context in art museums that show that the more emotion people are feeling, the more they're actually remembering from their visit later. So our research question was, what is the impact of all related emotions on memories of long-term learning of adult guests at art and science museums? Our study design is we work with 8 different sites of various content, style, scale. I'll show you those in a second. We gave a survey to guests when they were leaving, it appeared that they were leaving the building by approaching the doors on their way out. And then we emailed them the same survey with a couple of changes about 1 week later. Those who took the delayed survey got a $10 Amazon gift card as compensation. That's something else you have to do in informal learning environments because they're not a captive audience, so you have to incentivize. So our collaboration, the sites, my museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, the MCA, the Shed, the Paul Art Museum, the National Museum of Mexican Art, and then we had 2 outside of Chicago, the Denver Zoo and the Minneapolis Institute of Art. That was our high-tech data collection tracking board that Jana put together. So just to give you an idea of the difference between the different organizations, they range from 2.2 million annual visitors to 12,000. And we tried to do a difference between art museums and science museums. And then we separated science museum with animals and without animals as well. So we had 899 guests did the post-survey among all those institutions. About 550 of those did the delayed post-survey later, which is a really good response rate for us. Thanks, I think, largely to that $10 gift card. Overall, about 59% female, 37% male, which is more or less what the museum audience looks like at our institution. At least the average age, 35, which is 3 or 4 years younger than our average age at our institution. We asked guests, how many times have you been to an institution like this in the last 12 months? We got an average of 3.6. The survey instruments. I'm going to go into this in detail, but the summary of it is we measured factors of awe. Then we had 4 open-ended questions about learning and memories of their visit. And then we had some basic demographic and background questions as well. And they were all done on paper because we were outside most of the time. We couldn't use iPads or anything like that. So to measure awe, we adopted the situational awe scale, which was developed by our colleague at DePaul and one of her graduate students. And they basically found 4 factors of awe in their construction and validation of this instrument. That awe is connecting, that it can make you feel small, that isolation, that dark awe, and then the physical aspects of awe. And I'm going to talk about each of those here in a little bit more detail. So the liberating and connecting factor of awe, these are the items that guests rate on a 7-point scale for that particular factor. I feel free, I feel liberated, everything seems connected. The diminished self-awe, I feel physically smaller. I felt like I was trivial in the grand scheme of things. The isolating, so-called dark awe, I felt confined, tense, suffocated, oppressed. And then the final 4th factor, the physical characteristics of awe. My heart was racing, my breath was taken away, and I felt chills or goosebumps. So to measure learning, so we had 4 open-ended questions, and they were really open because these institutions are so different. The user experience is so different. The content is so different. The people that go there are so different. We couldn't ask about butterflies or submarines or Degas or anything like that. We had to have something really generic. So what is something you learned today? And then after piloting, we had to add the prompt. Describe as you would to a friend who did not attend, because people were given really small answers. They were writing like submarine or art or something like that. But then when we added this prompt, we were getting much better answers. So what is something that connected with you today? I wanted to use that because I thought that was a little bit more of an emotional measure. If you could talk to a director of exhibits now, what would you say to them? We asked that because a leading evaluator in the art education field, Smith, has asked this question at the Museum of Modern Art for the last 25 years, so he has really good data on it. It's been very interesting on it, so we want to be able to compare and contrast with that, which we haven't done yet. That's not part of this study. But I do analyze that data. And what is something unexpected about your visit? And we added that because of the psychology literature talking about how surprise and expectation violation is so important to awe. So the survey instrument also had some questions about prior knowledge, because we saw that very interesting result on the first study. We wanted to follow up on it, and we wanted to replicate it in some way and also see if there's any changes. So we used the same questions we used before. How much did you already know about that topic before today? And we added how much did you learn about that topic today? And then this expectation question at the bottom is something, again, because we're in a museum, you have to kind of give something back to the marketing departments and the other departments that kind of help sell this. And so we asked a question like that as well. demographics, basic gender, age, past museum visits, as I talked about. And then as a measure of socioeconomic status, we typically like to use completed formal education of parents or of adults themselves. And then occupational prestige, where we take their occupation and we use the prestige index created by NORC at the University of Chicago. I have not done that for this study yet. It's a lot of work. We haven't gone through and coded everything yet, hence the asterisks. And then we did the Scioto dispositional awe scale. That's a scale from the psychology literature that asks you 4 or 5 real easy questions to try to measure how likely you are to feel awe in life. Are you the kind of person that takes a lot to feel awe, or are you someone who's in awe of everything on it? And that would measure that. We wanted to use that as a covariate. And I have to have a double asterisk there because I do use it a little bit in the paper, but the fact is we didn't find much with that, so I'm not going to talk about that much more the rest, just to kind of keep this focused a little bit, because it's already a little bit hard to talk about this data. So let's talk about results for a second. So first thing we wanted to look at was differences between those who did the post-test and those who did the post-test and the delayed post-test to look for any evidence of bias. And so what you see there are those 4 factors of awe. And you can see that they do differ between them. And as a museum practitioner, I'm very happy to see that the positive aspects of awe are getting higher scores and the negative aspects of awe are getting lower scores on it. But we don't see a big difference between the post group and the post and delayed group. The difference to the isolating category is statistically significant, but as you can see, the magnitude is very, very small there. So we don't see a lot. In terms of demographics, the delayed post-test group was about 4% more female, slightly better educated, and had visited an institution an average of 1.5 times more often than our regular group. So there are differences, but we don't think these are major differences that would threaten the validity of our results. So now let's look at the main findings. All difference between institutional type. So blue are the science museums and zoos and aquariums averaged together, and green are the art museums. And basically, you don't see a difference. We don't see a big difference between the art and science museums. Again, it is statistically significant in the diminished self factor, but the difference is minor. It is not really large there. So we decided to break that up with the science group into the science groups that have animals and those who don't have animals, because we thought if you have animals, it might be a little bit different in empathic approach to it, or you might feel differently. But again, we don't see any big difference there as well. People are feeling the same types of awe. So we had those 4 open-ended constructed response items. How do we try to measure learning through those? So we took the answers and we coded them based upon 2 different frameworks. The first framework is based on the contextual model of learning by Lynn Deerking and John Falk. And this is the dominant model of learning in the informal science learning, or actually probably in the formal learning field in general now. And it has basically 3 basic contexts. The personal context, which is you taking into consideration why someone visited a museum, their background, their prior knowledge, things like that. And the visitor's sociocultural context, which is references to their cultural background or the cultural setting of the exhibit, social interactions that are happening in it, which is one reason why I wanted to use this in particular. And then a physical context, which is references to architecture and design features. When we were coding, we found no references to physical stuff in our stuff. So we eliminated that category from our analysis because it was basically just zeros all across the board. So for each of the 4 questions on the 2 surveys, we had 2 researchers code 25% of the data, and we had IR as reported there close to 90% for both categories. They coded them as a 1 or a 0 in each case. 1 being that there was some reference to a personal context or sociocultural context, and 0 meaning that there was no reference. The second framework we coded with was based on something called the generic learning outcomes by Eileen Hooper Greenhill. This is also a popular learning strategies coming around the 2000 time period. And what she wanted to do was create a model that was completely context independent from everything. And so we thought this worked for us because, again, we're doing so many different museums and so many different styles and everything. And so the broader measure, the wider net we could cast, the better. So she has basically these 5 categories in her model. References to anything outside of the museum from before their visit or after their visit. Knowledge and understanding, which is about learning new facts and information, coming to a deeper understanding, or thinking of things in new ways. Attitudes and values, which is change in feelings, perceptions, or opinions, or being able to give reasons for actions, and increase in empathy and tolerance. And then activity, behavior, progression is what do guests do, or what do they intend to do after their visit, and how they incorporate this into their lives. So just as before, we looked at each response and we coded a 1 or 0 for each of these categories. The inter-rater reliability is calculated on the first 24% of the responses. Overall, we had to do about 10,000 codes of all this, so it took a long time. It was a lot of work to put this together among all that. So I'm really proud of my team for that, and not for killing me afterwards. So let's look at the results of that. So first, here are the descriptives. So what we have across the top are those 4 factors of awe. And then what we have on the vertical scale are those codes. I'm sorry, those 4 factors on top are not awe. Those are the 4 questions that we ask. We're not talking about awe yet. So those 4 questions are across the top, and then the vertical column are the different codes. And so you see a 14 under personal context under learned means that 14% of all of the responses to the questions, what is something that you learned today, reference something personal in their life as defined by that rubric. And what you see here are lots of low numbers. There's not a lot of 14s, a lot of 7s, a lot of 11s. I mean, there's not a lot of references going on in these responses. We have a few categories that were kind of high, knowledge and understanding. So 75% of the people, when asked what is something you learned today, actually gave us an answer. It had to do with knowledge and understanding, not a surprise. But was kind of a surprise that attitudes and values are pretty high in the connected and in the exhibit questions. But for the most part, scores are low. So how does it have to do with awe? All right, there's a lot of numbers here. I'm going to point out the ones that are kind of interesting. You don't have to read them all. But let me just describe this a little bit. I'm going to go over here just because I don't have to keep walking in front of you. But what we have here are the average scores on the connecting awe factor for those who did have a reference to knowledge on this question. And then those who did not have a reference to knowledge on this question and as well. And then some statistical tests between the two. What we found is we only found a few areas that are traditionally statistically significant here, and then a few more that approach significance. So what we're looking here is we're not seeing giant patterns here in our results like we were kind of expecting. But one pattern we do find is that knowledge in 3 of the 4 questions was related to connecting awe. So the more awe that they reported on the survey, the more likely they were to talk about something that they learned about in 3 of those 4 questions. Something else that's interesting is, even though most of these are not statistically significant, in every case, the presence of the code is associated with a higher level of awe than the absence of the code. So if we had a theoretical reason to put to roll them up into a composite variable, probably have a really strong effect there. But I don't have a theoretical reason to do that right now, so I don't think it's honest yet to do that. But I want to point that out because it's something. So that is the connecting factor of awe. Now we look at the dark awe, the isolating factor of awe. Now here, we don't find anything that is traditionally statistically significant. And we find only 3 things that are approaching significance. So basically, I'm comfortable with saying that I don't see a link between a negative awe and the amount of learning people are reporting in these memories. The next slide, the physical aspects of the law. This is where we have a strong pattern that kind of jumps out pretty easily. When it comes to those physical aspects of the law, I feel chills, my heart skipped a beat on it. They're largely related to answers to the questions that have to do with what is something unexpected about your visit. So that's where that surprise aspect, we think that if you're feeling awe because of feeling surprise, it's probably manifesting itself in a physical way, or at least in a physical, metaphorically physical way. Anyway. And then the last factor, the self-diminishing awe. Again, here I don't think there's any real patterns that I'm comfortable saying that I feel real strongly about this. I think these are largely sporadic, except for, again, we see across the whole, all of the data, that if the code was present, if there was some sign of learning that they're talking about there, then they were reporting higher levels of awe than the other way around. Where you would think that it should be about 50-50. It should be up and down if it was pure noise. So beyond the codes, we also decided to do a word count as a measure of complexity. And we found that the more awe people reported, the longer their answers were. This is a small relationship, but it's there, and it's consistent except for with the dark negative awe, which is consistent with our first study, which is that we're not finding that the dark negative awe is really related to anything when it comes to learning on it. And also we see that the effect drops 1 week later, which I think would make kind of common sense as well. Ask questions about prior knowledge. We also look for the relationship for how much prior knowledge that they claim they have and how much awe they felt. And this basically backs up what we found in the first study, that having prior knowledge was related to, to more positive awe. So meeting expectations, I put it there because it's just for fun. The more people felt that they felt awe, the more that they were saying that the museum exceeded their expectations of the visit. And it's especially strong among the connecting awe. So that's something that we can use as a museum to help design future spaces. So summary of the finding. So awe did vary by factor among those 4 factors, but it did not vary much by the type of institution that they were at. Although science museums did show slightly more diminished self-awe, so people felt a little bit smaller at science museums, but again, that difference was not clear. There was also, one theory is that I'm playing with, is that this is related to, people are really feeling awe because they're expecting to have a new experience, and it's really context and dependent on it. So one way that we want to test this is to do these surveys outside of sporting centers, concert centers, dance performances, theater, just anything that you may go to 2 or 3 times a year, so you're expecting it to be a little bit different than your normal thing. Are they going to show the same levels and types of awe? That's one way to test that. We're not planning on doing that now because it takes a lot of resources. We don't have it yet, but we might. Especially if someone wants to donate another $125 million. Then awe is related to certain memories of learning. It wasn't across the scale, but the connecting types of awe was related to people talking about what they learned during their, or remembering what they learned during their visit. Physical awe was strongly related to surprise and unexpected experiences, but we didn't find much relationship with diminished self-awe or the isolating awe. But we did find awe is positively related to increased complexity of the memories that they had. Prior knowledge, amount of learning, meeting expectations was all related to increased positive awe on it, which is largely confirmation of what we had before. And then I always like to summarize things in just 2 or 3 sentences, just to make sure it makes sense to everybody. And one finding is that all related emotions are mostly consistent among art and science museums and cultural institutions. But greater positive awe is related to some guest perceptions of learning and more complex memories of their visit. And then prior knowledge is associated with more awe. So if I was talking to someone in an elevator, this would be my elevator pitch of the end of the study. So I'm going to jump into the next phase of my talk, which is only 3 slides about the museum and what we do, and hopefully what you can do at the museum. But before I do that, do we have any questions about this real fast? Yes, please.
I was curious when did you guys sample the respondents of the survey? Was it like on the weekend? Was it during the week, in the afternoon? Was it on like a day off from school? Right, I was curious when.
All of the above.
All of them?
Yeah,
okay.
I think we had 30-something days of data collection. And yeah, they're spread out all over the place.
Okay, yeah.
There's
Because I can
no
imagine like
intentionality to it.
sampling on certain days, right, might, make for different audiences or people.
Yes, yeah, we definitely, the sampling I would say was, for most of the data was October through December of last year. So that's a little bit of a window, but within that, there could be a lot of variation. Yes?
I'm wondering about, like, at least for me, 2 of the experiences that I've had in the museum that I felt that lot of sort of like physical or self-diminishing awe, or a little more of the negative awe, has been in the U-boat and also at the coal mine.
Yes.
And so I'm curious if any of what you found in those like more negative emotions were associated with any memories of those 2 places in your museum or not.
I can only speak anecdotally. We haven't analyzed it in a thematic way yet. But in terms of those open-ended questions, people talk about in our data the U505 all the time. They do not talk about the coal mine very much, which is interesting because the coal mine and the U505 are attended at about the same rate. And they're both our number 1 and 2 ticketed add-on experiences. Although the U505, you can see the outside of it for free. You just need a ticket for the onboard tour on it. But people talk about that a lot. I don't see any references in the U505 data. Yeah, I went through the coal mine. I went through the coal mine recently with my family, and it scared most of the kids we were with. And so I think I would add it to the study if I was doing it now. Yes?
You said that you looked at response length and found that there was some difference related to awe. Did you check at all for correlations between response rate and presence of the codes, like for the present or absent codes, to see if they showed up more in like just longer responses?
No, I would say probably there's a strong correlation because the more they wrote, the more likely we would find the presence of a code or not in it. But that's interesting. We could test it, see whether that's true or not. But no, we didn't look at it. We only looked at it with the all measures. That's a good question. I'm happy to. I'm not trying to be a jerk, but I'm happy to share this data if anybody wants to play around with it. Just because we try to open all our data for anybody. So if anybody wants to look at it themselves, if you want to do a little project on it or something, let me know. So I'm not trying to push my work onto you. Anything else? Yes.
One question. I'm really interested in this. Statement about the complex memories, and to me that seems where like awe really takes hold and you form those more intricate memories. But I think I'm missing what it was from the data that led you to say that they're more complex memories. Is it the length of those constructed responses? Is that why you're...
Yeah, that's all I'm saying.
Okay.
It's simply length, that's all. Now, we did in our phase 1, that phase 1 study I talked about, we did analyze the open-ended questions using LIWC, the linguistic inquiry word count, to try to look for specific patterns in the different word counts, like more use of pronouns, more use of references to time, and things like that. And we didn't find any differences related to awe in that. So we thought if you're feeling more awe, you might be more likely to talk about the future, for example. And there's some data saying if you're feeling awe, you're more likely to talk about other people than yourselves. So we thought there might be pronouns about you that might be more common on it. we didn't find it. I have not done that level of analysis with this particular data. That was with the first study data. So I'm interested and we could, but I'm also not an expert at that, so I kind of gave it a very superficial look. Please.
You found differences in awe through the demographics. Did you take a look and see that those who are more educated had more sense of positive negative awe as opposed to those who are less educated? Was there a difference that you saw in your data?
Yeah, for this study, we haven't done that yet because we're going to fold that into socioeconomic status, and I mentioned we're going to add that with the occupational prestige thing. So we haven't done that yet. With my prior study, I hate to keep bringing that up, we did, and there was a slight effect that higher levels of education was related to more awe. It was really, really small, though. We also had a large sample for that study. It was like 800 or 900, so I think it was a sample thing, but the effect size was really tiny. But it was there. And I think it's not surprising considering that we found the relationship with prior knowledge was positive with awe. Yeah. Yes?
Not a question, but just sort of like a comment. The last point that you have here, prior knowledge is associated with more awe, makes me think about how you might use that information for teachers who are bringing their students to the museum. There have been times where I'm like, we're just going because we're just going to have some fun. And then
Yep.
there are times where we're seriously studying something and then we go, and so I'm
Yep.
curious if you have thoughts about that last point.
No, definitely. If we follow up with this study, and I'm not sure we are, we spent 3 years on it and are kind of burned out. But if we follow up, there's two things we're going to follow up on. One is we want to create an age-appropriate scale for kids, and we want to do it with field trips. That's like our number one goal now. But that's going to be a lot of work, and so that's why we're not sure we're going to do it. So we get that answer. But our theory is that we tell people, teachers all the time, you have to do the pre-visit and stuff, and you have to do the post-visit stuff, and we give you stuff to do it. And the research on field trips has been saying that for decades, that you need to do this, and most teachers don't do it. So maybe this is a more easy way to convince teachers, like it's an easier pitch to them. Being like, look, if you just tell them a little bit more about what they're going to see, they're going to appreciate it a little bit more, and therefore when they get back, they're going to be thinking a little bit better. So that's our theory on it. Yes?
So in this study, you're focusing on awe, and that's a real important thing you want to see happening, right? So are there some other things, let's say you shifted to some other thing about the museum and experience that you think is also important? It's distinct and different from awe, or is that like?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great
essential
question, and it
thing?
segues very well into our next thing.
Oh.
So it's almost as if I set you up for it. But we haven't met before. I mentioned we're ending on now. Our next version of this is probably going to be around belonging. Is a sense of belonging at museums, and we've already started collecting some data and practicing some or piloting some questionnaires on that subject. But we want to see how that changes based on people's backgrounds, demographics, race, ethnic identity, age, education, and why they're coming here, their motivation for coming to the museum, and then their experience at the museum and stuff. And I'm sure a lot of people do not feel like they belong at the museum, and we need to find out who they are and why and what we can do about it. So I think that's probably going to be our next 2 to 3 year study. And I'm happy to collaborate with anybody because that's a big thing too that's taken us, there's a lot of literature on it, so it's taken us a lot of time to even get started on it. But nothing in museums or informal, it's all school-based stuff, and place-based stuff. Any other questions on this? All right, 3 slides to advocate for working at the museum, for doing stuff with us. So first of all, my team, I've got a team of 6, about to be 7, because we're about to hire another person. Here they are, this is where we work. Faith knows this area very well, as does Rabia on it. We have a wide team. Some of them are psychologists, some of them are museum people. 3 of them have degrees in community psychology. And everyone except for the TBH is a permanent position. It's not soft money. So they're around and really know what's going on. And we love to collaborate. We love to work with people. We work with all of the universities in Chicago except UIC. We work with Northwestern, DePaul, Loyola, University of Chicago, of course, because they're across the street. And we would love to do stuff with you because I come from a learning sciences program. I want to do more of it, and I've already said that to some of you in this room. So the second slide is what we do. So our next big thing is who belongs in museums. But also, we're running currently a big study on the impact of live facilitation of science learning. We have a lot of live facilitators. They're very expensive. Most museums can't do it at the level that we do it. We need to find out what the impact is and try to justify that, and also change it if we need to do it better. We're in the middle of that now. We're doing a longitudinal study of our adolescent development program. And that study is following 3 cohorts of kids that they graduate the program as they go through college. This is our last year, the NSF part, but my dream is I'm going to follow these kids the rest of their lives. I want to find out how being part of our museum adolescent development program impacted everything and impacted their kids later, if there is any. I don't know, but it's a mixed methods, ethnographic plus quantitative annual survey program. We just got a 3-year grant this summer to take a look at one of our field trip programs and look at it through a race and ethnic identity lens. How are different groups getting different experiences coming through this field trip program at the museum? I got a second grant to do a conference next summer on the impact of non-science art and science education. So STEAM is big, but it's always about science stuff. It's about science pictures. Well, what about art for the sake of art? How can that be used in science education settings, and when the artists and the scientists are treated equally, not as art always supporting science? And so we're going to have a conference on that next summer at MSI and also at the School of the Art Institute. And then we got another awarded a conference next summer about bringing equity and culture into whole school STEM reform models. So if any of you are interested in STEM reform at the whole school level, please talk to me. We'd love to have more partners on that. And then we also do small things, like do people get confused in our rotunda? One of our staff members is doing a project on that right now. On it, and so it's kind of fun stuff. The reason I mention all this is I want you to see the wide variety of stuff that we do in the museum, and this is like maybe a third to half of our current active projects on it. So if you have ideas, talk to me. I would love to talk to you. Probably we have something in the museum that can align with what you're doing. So what can we do for you, or what you can do at the museum? So you can study an aspect of the museum. The museum is very open to external researchers. We always have external people coming in and studying stuff at various different levels. And so if you have an idea, you want to look at something, I can probably make it happen. Or you can simply use this as a data collection place. You just need data from a lot of people that don't normally come to a campus like this. We're a great place to get that data. On any given weekend, we usually have 2 external university researchers collecting data. People are there all the time. We've got a process and a policy on how to do this. And it's free. We don't charge you anything on it. And so if you just need a place to get data, we're really good for that. Do you need to pilot test instruments with kids before you go in a classroom? We've got kids, and we've got 1.5 million people visiting per year. So we can tailor the demographics. You talked about how they change over time. We've got the demographic analysis about how they change based on days of the week, based on school holiday, not school holiday, season, weather. I can tell you how they change based on the weather outside. Hey, we know how they change based on time of day and all sorts of stuff. So we can help you really target. Or if you need to prototype any equipment. We have a lot of people who come in and prototype exhibit stuff or games or anything like that. And finally, you can volunteer and be a part of our team. We always have positions for interns through all those NSF grants we just got. We're going to be hiring 4 to 5 interns the next couple of years for all those projects that you saw. So if you're looking for a summer gig or you're looking for a few hours here or there and you want something on your resume, I write really good letters of recommendation. Got it?
He
Few
does.
people into the program here. Thanks. I'm happy to do that, and we also treat our interns equally. You're members of our team. You're open to come to all of our staff meetings, retreats, and you get to be co-authors on our papers, as you should be. So we try to be a real equitable thing. And finally, lastly but not least, get a job. We hire. I have an opening now. It's pretty late in the process, so I can't apply to that one. But generally, I usually have an opening on my team about once every 2 years or so on it. So when you graduate, I would love to hire another learning scientist. I'm surrounded by community psych people. I need some learning scientists to put it back in. So that's it. Thank you. Email me again.